Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Zero to Exit. This is Nilima and Ankur, your hosts. In today's show, we are pleased to have John Viega, founder and CEO of Capsule8, a security startup focusing on infrastructure security for VMs and containers in public and private clouds. Capsule8 was recently acquired by Sophos, a leader in cybersecurity. Prior to founding Capsule8, John held leadership roles at BAE Systems, McAfee, and many other cybersecurity companies. When he's not building companies, John is educating. He has co-authored 6 books on security and is an adjunct professor of computer science at NYU. Hi, John. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Many congratulations on the Sophos acquisition. You've had multiple exits in your career. How does this one feel compared to the others?
They've all been great learning experiences in their own way, but we're particularly proud of what we accomplished with Capsule 8. We were solving problems for people, being able to get visibility into what was happening in their production infrastructure that they couldn't safely get any other way for some very large tech brands, and helping them with their problems has been great. And then having Sophos with such a large footprint, we're really excited that what we did is about to have an even larger impact on the market.
Is the excitement like Giannis winning his first NBA championship, or is it like LeBron who has been there, done that before? So the happiness is kind of the old news.
No, I'd say it's more the former. It's unique and special.
Yeah, no, congratulations once again. It's always exciting. I mean, I've had a couple and never gets old. Definitely super happy for yourself and your teams. We'll spend plenty of time on Capsule8 and your journey, but I want to go back a little bit on the time machine. Back in 2001, you wrote a book called Building Secure Software. This book was meant for developers and was arguably way ahead of its time. Now, with the rise of DevSecOps and shift left security, the industry is just waking up to the notion that you got to bring security to the developers, not the other way around. Tell us a little bit about the circumstances that led to you writing this book way back when.
My first job out of college was in '98 at a company called Reliable Software Technologies. It's the company that became Cigital, which was acquired by Synopsys not too long ago. And I was working for Gary McGraw, who was doing software security and had started doing consulting. We started up, actually, it was Gary, myself, and Brad Arkin, who was CISO at Adobe for a long time and is now at Cisco. We started doing consulting for software security for companies like Visa and Symantec. And it was really clear to us that software was at the core to many of the industry's problems, and that it would be a much more cost-effective place to fix it. There really not a lot of people were talking about it. Building Secure Software was the first book about software security, but only by a couple of months. The Mike Howard book came out just a few months after ours. So it was definitely clear that it was going to be an important space, but we were pretty idealistic about it too at the time. I mean, I think that nobody really understood how hard it would be to do the job well. So within a couple of years, it was obvious that not every software engineer was going to be able to learn everything they needed to know to be good at software security. So we learned that just like water always follows the path of least resistance, so are companies that are trying to get focus on their business, and really had to make it much easier to do security. So software security.
If I may ask, when did that realization come in? The idealism of doing the right things versus water following the path of least resistance. Is it more because academia to moving into cybersecurity practice? When did that realization happen?
Yeah, there's a Yogi Berra quote that I like. There's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And that became more clear when I was doing my first startup, Secure Software, which was building static analysis tools for security. And certainly people were very interested in getting ahead of the problem, but I really learned that a startup needs to solve important problems for people, but do it without creating significant problems at the same time. So you need to kind of be a huge net benefit when you take into consideration all the friction that you add. And every startup adds friction, like doing anything new and different creates some sort of cost associated with it. And you need to always be focused on minimizing that. But with Secure Software, we were using like all the best academic algorithms and innovating our own to find exploitable conditions in software automatically. And it turned out that the other considerations like integrating it with build systems and making sure that you could handle every variant of the compiler, like all the challenges there led to a lot of friction for actually getting to that value that made it harder to get widespread adoption. And we were in the market before competitors there. Like the big competitor at the time was Fortify, and we lost for a couple reasons. One was our tech was a lot more accurate and better, but it created a lot of friction. If you compare that to what Fortify was doing at the time, I found out years later that they were actually using they'd licensed a tool that I'd written at Cigital, which was essentially a grep tool, which has huge accuracy problems, but doesn't have any of those problems about needing to be part of the build process or just worrying about different versions of the compiler or so on. It was very easy to integrate with. And then the other thing that we learned was sales cycles for very large enterprises were really long and arduous. So mainly sold to big financial institutions and government, but it would take years to do that. And so we ended up selling to Fortify, but as my friend Pete Markowski said, it was Bowflex money. So
Never heard that before. Well said.
yeah.
First startup I worked with, my CEO had this quote. He said, in startups, you're either too early or too late.
Mhm.
And crafting that balance is important. And what a big opportunity, right? Like AppSec or SAST and DAST has like been around for 20 years and arguably the biggest security category. And in security, I suppose we have to always straddle between sort of the simplicity, but then getting it right, which tends to be
Mhm.
more complicated. Like over the years, have you sort of cracked the code on it? Like, so if you have to build a security startup right now and choose between simple and secure, but that does introduce some friction, be it proxying traffic or encrypting data, how should people think about striking that balance?
Yeah, well, so I left that startup and went to McAfee in 2004, and McAfee really helped crystallize my thinking on how to build products in the security space. They were big adherents to pragmatic marketing, and the core tenet is essentially that my opinion is pretty irrelevant when it comes to what the right solution is. It's important to understand your potential customers, the problems they have that are important problems, not like kind of their less important problems, and understand them deeply so that you can understand what additional problems you might create with your solution. So it's not that the listening to the market is important to understand the problems you need to solve. That doesn't come from academia. So with Secure Software, we had kind of the academic view of what the solution should be, which is let's put the best possible algorithm on it. And for a lot of reasons, that wasn't going to be practical for like a decade or more. So it's really about assuming that you don't know enough to build the right thing. And my entire career at McAfee since, I've prioritized getting out there, talking to as many potential customers as possible, listening to what they think their problems are. Then they don't always know what the solutions are. If they knew what the solution was, then they would have already gotten the solution. But they understand their problems really, really well. So,
Yep, yep. And you had a successful exit with SilverSky, which was your second startup, right, John?
yeah, yeah.
And that was acquired by BAE for over 200 million, when that kind of money meant something compared to nowadays. Can you tell our listeners for a start what SilverSky product did?
Yeah, SilverSky was actually a turnaround of a portfolio company that was in the Bessemer and Goldman Sachs portfolio. And when we got there, it was half managed security services focused on small US banks and credit unions, where it had about 15% of that market, and half of it was a Microsoft Exchange hosting business, if you can believe that. And this was at a time where 365 was absolutely poised to dominate the market and eat up all that business. And the business had been very stagnant, and we ended up investing in building email security product on top of that was still really innovative with real-time zero-day protection that worked very, very well, looking for in-browser attacks, that kind of thing, phishing. And we focused on selling that to SilverSky's existing users and kind of managing out any, call it, bad revenue. And so we ended up building a great book of IP, a great business around that, had some phenomenal large enterprise customers where we were really happy about the impact we had, giving visibility into what real threat actors were doing at places like United Airlines. And that was a really fun time for us before getting acquired by BAE.
This was post your gig at McAfee, and you just mentioned that
Mhm.
a lot of things you learned at McAfee from a go to market perspective. Any tenants that you applied at this company from that experience, which was different from your first startup?
We didn't go in assuming we knew what we were going to bring to market. We had this existing customer base that was going to be easy to leverage if we could solve some meaningful problems to them. And so I spent at least a year with a lot of my attention on what problems does this customer base have that we're well positioned to solve for them, that are kind of important problems for them, if that makes sense. And so that was kind of key.
Yeah, speaking of McAfee, I know you've had a couple stints there as well, and I asked this question to Stu McClure as well, which is, the McAfee alums have gone on to do big and great things. I call them the McAfee Mafia. There was something special there. Obviously, Nilima is an alum as well herself. What was so special about McAfee? What was like some top two, three things you learned there?
Well, before the Intel exit, McAfee was a phenomenal place that was very customer focused and very much also took pride in the quality of the tech that they built too. There's a lot more innovation there than you would expect in a company that size. And McAfee's strength at the time was that they had built like a single central management platform for the enterprise with EPO, something that nobody ever really kind of copied. The usability that EPO brought to the table, that came from the CTO at the time, Christopher Bolin, his absolute adherence to pragmatic marketing, spending a lot of time with his customers and knowing how he could really bring value to them that transcended just being a good security product, if that makes sense. So EPO's value wasn't really in the fact that it was a security product, it was that it simplified management at the time. And that really distinctive competence that McAfee had kind of dissolved after the Intel acquisition. Now, I'm not blaming it on Intel. There was also kind of the shift to the cloud at the same time, and EPO didn't really evolve with it for whatever reason, and I wasn't there to see it.
Yeah, I can attribute to EPO. Every acquisition had to get into EPO in the first 6 months. And that sort of resonates a lot with what John said as well, Ankur, that when you're adding more solutions, don't add more problems to your customers. And EPO is sort of simplified introduction of new tech because there was a familiar element and there was an unfamiliar element, right? So
Yeah, they did the product to platform journey in a way much before platforms and marketplaces became kind of fashionable. So definitely kudos to the leadership team at McAfee. Moving swiftly along to Capsule8 journey, obviously this is where we want to learn quite a bit. In one of your interviews, you mentioned that you started Capsule8 because you don't see a really good EDR solution for server and Linux environments. Tell us a little bit more about the events and circumstances that led to founding of Capsule8.
I was having lunch with the late venture capitalist Harry Weller, who was at NEA, and I asked him, what are the biggest problems that you see in the marketplace that aren't being well addressed? And he said, well, nobody is at runtime able to detect real attacks happening in a way that anybody will deploy. And in his view, there needed to be like kind of a modern version of Snort, something that could in real time look at all the data you had and allow you to respond in real time. And that struck a chord because after we had been acquired by BAE, there was a big European MSSP that they had already had as part of their business, and they merged it all together. And so we had these large enterprise customers in Europe that were chomping at the bit for us to do managed detection and response for their Linux estate, whether that was in kind of mission critical systems sitting in a data center or like industrial controls or in the public cloud. And we thought, oh, well, that shouldn't be a big deal. The EDR vendors have Linux solutions, and we tested them all out and found that they really didn't tend to work or do anything. And the one or two that had some basic functionality, like that we could get some visibility that we could build detection on top of, we did a trial with a couple of customers, and they immediately said, no way would we deploy this. You have to take it out. It's absolutely killing our system. So it too much network traffic, too much CPU, too much risk. So when Harry said that night, I had a dinner scheduled with two of the people who became co-founders, Dino Dizovi and Brandon Edwards. And they got really excited about the problem as well. It resonated with them, and they immediately had some ideas on what an architecture to address the problem would look like. And so we didn't really start building a commercial product right away, though. I mean, there was some prototyping, but we instead spent at least a year interviewing as many people as we could about the problem. This was after we raised our seed round. We spent a year talking to anyone who would really listening to anybody who would talk to us about how they think about security in production environments, focused really on high-tech companies first and foremost. We thought that they're on the bleeding edge, they are growing fast, and they have challenges with performance and scale that other companies coming up behind them will eventually run into, but they're going to have a better sense of problem space, and they're also going to be easier to do business with if they want to buy what we end up putting together to solve the problems. And so that's what we did, and we got a really consistent story that security teams have no visibility to production. Like many of them had tried to deploy EDR solutions into Linux and had huge challenges. Nobody in that sector would actually run EDR and anything mission critical in production because it would drive up cost. These things are built for Windows systems and ported over, where like on a Windows desktop, it's not really doing anything. So if you're not that efficient, it doesn't really get noticed, but in production, it translates to dollars. Kernel modules in production are too huge a risk to take, and you really need to work in a way that is like can guarantee good behavior if there are memory constraints and work inside CPU constraints and not generate too much data and the system is really busy. It needs to decay gracefully, like load shed in a way that's intelligent. And all of that is kind of outside the spirit of the security industry in a sense, because, if you go back to like common criteria, the notion is thou shalt never lose an auditable event. And we see that with kind of Linux's audit D, which was built by McAfee in the common criteria era to never lose an auditable event. And one thing that we heard from a few security teams was, oh, we tried to build ourselves some visibility and detection on top of audit D, but it would fall over when systems got too busy.
So, on one dimension, you were dealing with this sort of, hey, there is no good solution available on these systems that's performant and yet more secure. But the other big paradigm shift that was happening, obviously, was cloud and the life cycle of a server, like the pets and cattle analogy that we often use. How much was that part of your consideration as well, that whatever stack I build, I want to make sure that I'm treating these servers as cattle and not pets? So something that works across CI/CD is more nimble, more agile. Was that an afterthought, or was that sort of early on in the baking of the software itself?
No, we did a lot of learning in that first year and saw the motivation for the whole shift left movement. We talked at the beginning of this conversation about software security having a lot of hurdles to make practical, and investment in it didn't really pick up until kind of the public cloud started picking up. And that shift left movement, from what we learned, seemed to be pretty largely motivated by production getting to be the place where it was too costly and too expensive to do security. It became more cost effective to try to put as much assurance into what you're deploying before it actually goes into production. And that's not really what people wanted, though. We heard over and over and over again that they want to have a pretty diverse security program, but well balanced. And they were left with a position where they had very, very little visibility into what was going on in production, if that makes sense. So the shift left movement is kind of done some great things recently, and I think that CI/CD world that just has really made it easier to get good assurance of software before you deploy it, but that still doesn't address the risk once you're in production if there's like a 0 day or an end day or a misconfiguration that makes it into prod.
So there is operational friction and there is data friction. And in your RSA Innovation Sandbox in 2019, the pitch, you mentioned the value of good data in detections. Why is having good data important for detections?
Well, the other thing that I think we've noticed, and I've certainly noticed this for a lot longer than kind of the rise of the cloud, but security operations has long had alert fatigue, right? There's just too much data going into the SOC that more data than any human could ever respond to. And so it's one thing to invest in automation to try to prioritize the things that you look at, knowing that you're dropping tons of things on the floor. But our view was we could get much higher fidelity signal if we could get insight at the host level instead of having to get that signal from the network level. We could see what was actually going on the box, not just like the network traffic flows and second order evidence. We could see actually was going on in memory, what people were typing and what they were seeing when they were interactively logged into machines, and just kind of a higher fidelity signal and give much better results. And so Capsule8 default detection analytic generally provide very few alerts, very low false positive rate with a lot of context behind it. And one of our customers was speaking at our sales kickoff in January and essentially said that whenever Capsule8 does give an alert, they drop everything because they know they have to take it seriously, because it doesn't happen very often. And we give them so much context that they know that we're very much on top of it.
And this takes me to the next question. So in a very noisy vendor market, everyone's saying, I have good detections. How do you kind of differentiate? So there is, of course, the marketing pieces of it, but really everyone's claiming now good data is important and the detections. How should customers be thinking about evaluating the vendors claiming the same claim?
We loved technical bake-offs. We would encourage people to get their hands on vulnerable images and exploits for those images, and kind of build whatever attack chain they wanted and see what we did versus something else that they thought might solve the problem for them. There's one customer where the test was to exploit Nginx, an app running in Nginx, then exploit a local kernel vulnerability and disable SE Linux, all without ever touching the disk. That attack chain, SE Linux doesn't even complain. All it says is, hey, I just got turned off. That's the only log message that you would see with the attack chain used in that evaluation. But Capsule8 detected it a bunch of different ways, and nobody else saw it at all. The container escape, nothing. That worked really well for us. If people cared about the quality of detection, we were always going to win. And that's even before you got to performance, where we have those controls that nobody else in the security space has, so that you can say we're not to exceed these operational constraints, CPU, memory, but also like asking the kernel to do work for us as well.
Well said. Yeah. One more question I had, slightly different. I'm moving away a little bit from tech, but you've also mentioned a few times that Capsule8 had a pretty high bar in hiring. And in Silicon Valley, startups and big corporations always talk about hiring A players and the importance of 10x engineers and 10x sellers. And yet we see a typical bell curve across all organizations. You have a handful of 10xers. What are some of your secrets to hiring top engineers?
The first thing is that we wouldn't hire an engineer if we couldn't find somebody who fit our bar. We would just keep looking. Often people have a view of, hey, we've been looking for a month or two, and we need to settle for. We would encourage people to keep looking until they found somebody who really jumped the bar. And also, the second thing is that if we made a mistake in hiring, we would move to fix it fast. And really, great engineers want to work with other great engineers, and they know when other people are being carried, and that causes resentment. So we wanted to provide a great environment, and we also wanted to make sure that people were good at being humble and interacting with the team. And so there was that kind of sense of not just is the bar a technical bar, there was kind of a cultural aspect to the bar. And then the other thing is having feeder relationships too. Relationships get good people in. And for us, we've got a deep relationship with NYU Tandon. I've been an adjunct professor there. My co-founders have all spent a lot of time volunteering over there, and the smart up and coming kids see that we have deep technical bench and that we're doing interesting things and having a big impact. And I think for most engineers, myself for sure, having an impact is one of the things that is most motivating in a career.
John, when I was part of Solid Core, I think we followed the same methodology. We were based out of India and
Mhm.
we had good relationships with IITs, and we were able to get new joinees because everyone wants to work on in the kernel space when you're coming out from that side. And so Capsule8 had a successful exit with Sophos,
Mhm.
but knowing what you know now, would you have done anything differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. It took us a couple of years after we had a good sense of the problems we needed to solve. It took us a couple of years to really build our way to a GA product that we had some great design partners, like Fastly in particular, that really iterated with us a lot to get there. But boy, if I knew how to do that out the gate and we could have gotten to market a lot faster, then what I would have liked to have done was also invest in having like kind of a free version. I said that Harry Weller's original idea was like kind of a modern snort, and we definitely wanted to do that. We just, by the time we were ready to hit the market, we couldn't afford to do that, if that makes sense.
It does. Moving swiftly along, I want to talk a little bit about sort of your background. And you've done sort of both academia and the startup scene. And we don't often see somebody who has done both, right? And you've got a good mix of that. How have you applied what you've learned in academia in company building and vice versa?
I'm not sure that there's much beyond the raw technical skill that I learned from academia that translated very well, unfortunately. And I think that's something that I've seen throughout my career is that there's a pretty broken feedback loop most of the time. There are some places that do a good job, but usually academia is incentivized based on novelty. Like if you're looking to get your PhD or be a tenure track professor, or just everything is it novel in the academic literature, which doesn't necessarily translate to having a market impact. And so, assuming that most of it doesn't, then industry is not really going to pay much attention. And so, there's not as much incentive for industry to open the kimono to the research world and actually help them understand what problems are out there that academia can help solve. And so it's really kind of a challenge and leads to situations where there are prominent papers in academia that essentially recreate the wheel, stuff that industry has already been doing for a long time. That's not great. So I've definitely tried to wade into that problem where I could. It's one of the reasons why I love NYU Tandon is because it's a very applied engineering department with deep relationships in the business world with a real mission to make an impact. I've also kind of done work on the standard side. That's where like the IETF in particular and the IEEE are kind of one of the few places where there are enough people around the table that listen to each other that occasionally you can make some real advances. Usually in the standards world, though, not the publication world.
And are there any ways that cybersecurity industry should be thinking overall about changing that? It's great that you've been obviously helping, but I think it will take a movement across the industry to give back as well.
Yeah, I think anybody who values their academic career should give back. I mean, I have always felt that way, partially because I come from, like, my mother was a teacher, but also when I went into grad school, the famous computer scientist Bill Wolf was a professor in the department and gave pretty impassioned speech that said exactly the same thing, that if you value your education, you should give back at some point in your career. And I would love to see that happen, but I think it would also be great if academia were to value commercial impact, to have like a set of journals that are where the criteria aren't about research novelty, but they're prestigious because you wrote a paper that showed this architecture you collaborated on with industry that actually made a big impact on the world.
I mean, do you think the rise of sort of this open source and developer-led go-to-market and just the different types of distribution where the entry barriers are less, the academics won't have to hire a whole bunch of salespeople to actually see their stuff in real world. Do you think that given the change in the market dynamics will allow us to see more research from universities actually make it into real world applications and products?
It certainly could. I would like to hope so. I think anything that fosters better communication is likely to have an impact. And kind of the open source and kind of open standard world has definitely been where the core of that impact was. Last time we talked, we were talking about the GCMAS algorithm, that the encryption algorithm I did with David McGrew at Cisco, which now, kind of the default TLS cipher suite, very widely used across the internet. And that was academic work that I was doing on the side with some friends that was started out as purely academic work with like Yoshi Kono, who's now at University of Washington. And we were focused on having an open algorithm for just like open, meaning patent free, royalty free algorithm for authenticated encryption, because the standards community really wanted to adopt it. And David McGrew at Cisco came to me and said, wow, I really like this work that you did here, but let me tell you all the reasons why this isn't practical for all the hardware vendors that would really love to have something like this. And here's why we would like to have it and all the constraints that we have to operate on. And so David had a good bead on what was right for not just Cisco's customers, but he was working in the standards community, understood what was right for the broader market. And that was kind of one of the most satisfying collaborations of my life. So I'd say the crypto world in general has done a pretty good job of kind of that academia industry collaboration, but mainly around kind of open standards. When you get to proprietary, it doesn't work very well.
Almost sounds like every journal should have two validation exercises with someone in industry. If that becomes a mandate, things will at least have some validation somewhere.
I would love to see that. That would be great.
What areas of security are absolutely essential to address today and are not getting enough attention?
Well, by who, I guess, is my question. I think that it varies depending on the market. I think that for a lot of people in the cloud, operational security, like actually getting that visibility into production, is one of the biggest challenges. I think that for a lot of smaller businesses, it's really the ransomware problems, their biggest issue. And I think for critical infrastructure, the problems are almost more political. Like, how could the Colonial Pipeline hack going to have shut down so much of a nation's oil supply without having to consult the government, particularly when it wasn't the attacker who had shut it down, it was the vendor who decided to shut it down. So, it really depends on the sector, I guess, is my view.
Yeah, and email security is not going anywhere either. I was
No.
just Bloomberg ran an expose recently. There was this guy, Hush Puppies, ran a massive email scan impersonating CEOs and purportedly writing emails to the bookkeeping and accounting team to siphon off money and say, hey, pay $1 million to this vendor. Ran this for 3 years. He was one of the hottest Instagrammer, 3 million followers. Nobody asked him, like, how do you make all this money? But this was all massive scam. But it's all ran over email, right? And that appears to be not going. Apparently, the last stat I read, FBI spends anywhere close to, it's a $20 to $30 billion worth of scam on an annual basis. Awesome.
Awesome.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Zero to Exit. John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time, and wishing you all the success at Sophos and beyond.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.